What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some gameplay and thoughts on the closed beta for Steelrising. This is a game that is releasing in just a couple weeks on September 8th, I believe it is, which brings me to my first major point. While they're calling this a closed beta, it's effectively 2 weeks and right before launch. So while I imagine they'll be able to gain some useful data from this, realistically, calling this a beta and being able to fix a lot of this stuff is highly doubtful, in my opinion. Not that there's a lot to fix. What I've played is actually pretty polished, but my point is, this is more marketing than a beta, if we're being real. On to the actual game. This is a game I've personally been looking forward to quite a bit, and for me, it has not disappointed. But first and foremost, if you're unaware, this game is a Souls-like, and that's probably the most important bit of information to know because it is a Souls-like through and through, meaning that if you do not like that type of game, you are unlikely to like Steelrising. But nonetheless, despite being a Souls-like, it does do a few unique things. So for starters, we of course play as a robot, if you couldn't tell by what was on screen already. More specifically, we play as a robot named Aegis, who was originally a sort of dancing automaton turned into a sort of bodyguard for the Queen, as the game takes place during the French Revolution in an alternative history, obviously where automatons are rather commonplace. Aegis has seemed to have gained some amount of sentience, and at the beginning of the game, you are sent by the Queen to stop the King, who has caused the revolution, essentially, by his poor choices. So, we'll be piloting Aegis in our Souls-like combat across Paris. Now, the beginning of the game starts off as a bit of a tutorial, of course, kind of teaching you the basics, which we're going to go over right now. Now, probably my favorite thing about the combat thing that's new here is they added this sort of stealth mechanic. It's actually possible to sneak up on enemies and get a massive first hit in that in some cases can just outright kill an enemy. However, you have to lock on to a target and they have to have not seen you yet, and then you'll enter a sort of sneak mode that is you just kind of hunched over a little bit, and once you get close enough that the lock-on cursor turns red, you can attack and then you'll perform a sneak attack that will do a ton of damage and usually knock them down. And you can tell that they kind of thought of this mechanic a lot as it comes up quite a bit, and in many cases you can find like little alternative routes that actually swing you around behind enemies, I imagine specifically for this mechanic. Now, another thing to keep in mind that's actually, as far as I know, relatively unique to this game is the instant cooling. So you have a stamina bar, but this is actually kind of role-played as your heat. So you're an automaton, you're generating heat, so you overheat when you run out of stamina. However, if you hit E, you can use some of your alchemy to do a sort of instant cooling thing that will usually deal some damage to enemies, and overall it's just kind of cool and unique and kind of keeps you in the combat a little bit. But beyond that, the combat is relatively straightforward in terms of what a Souls-like usually is, but there are a lot of cool things that kind of lean into that sort of steampunk vibe. A lot of our weapons come down to things like bladed fans, claws, chains that you can whip around, a halberd, and you'll actually kind of get to pick a starting style and character creation. You can slightly customize the appearance of Aegis herself. However, the main thing that you'll do at character creation is pick one of 4 starting classes. This is going to determine your starting stats as well as your starting weapons. Now, this is by no means definitive or unable to be kind of worked around, but it's a starting point and dictates kind of how you play at the beginning. Now, another cool thing to keep in mind here, though, is that weapons tend to come with alchemical effects potentially. So each weapon has a light attack, a heavy attack, and a special attack. Oftentimes, some weapons that have alchemical effects, one of those attacks will apply that effect. And typically speaking, this is just a status effect, and it can be either burning, freezing, lightning, that kind of thing. But that's important as enemies can do it to you too, for starters, but also because the status effects are a big deal. And they can really change the flow of combat, as freezing an enemy will freeze them in place for quite some time, meaning you can get a bunch of free hits in. And this is really important when you start realizing there are grenades in-game that will apply these effects. Grenades in this game are ridiculous. They're very overpowered. And if you have enough of them, you can honestly just tear through bosses with the grenades. And I wouldn't be surprised if this sees a tiny bit of a nerf, or maybe it's intentional as a sort of easy mode to get through some fights, because there are fights where literally if you have enough grenades, you will never get hit because you can just chuck grenades at the boss. But beyond that, while we're on the subject, one thing that I really like about this, just like thoughts-wise, is the way Aegis moves and all of the automatons, because I don't really want to feel like a human robot running around in this, and I think they nailed making Aegis feel like a robot in terms of the way she moves. It's very robotic, and I'm a really big fan of how they managed to implement that, as the way she moves isn't really what you'd consider natural. Now, some other cool stuff, kind of traditional Souls-like really, but as you kill things, you'll gain sort of spirit essence, and then you'll use this to upgrade your various stats. There are 6 of them in total. These will upgrade your base stats. You can also find special items, which combined with the essence can then upgrade your weapons as well, so your weapons are upgradable. There seems to be about 5 or 6 different types of weapons, and then you can find variations therein that will like have different alchemical effects, that type of stuff. So there are definitely a few different types of play styles. Alchemy probably seems the most interesting, as this isn't magic exactly, but it lets you use a lot of special attacks, as most of your special attacks from your weapons are powered by alchemical capsules, which can then do alchemy damage, and various different types of weapons will scale off one of your 6 stats, one of which is kind of that alchemy build, so that's something to keep in mind, as I think that's probably the most unique approach to combat, as the rest of it is kind of like more tanky, melee damage, or kind of quick, agile damage, but definitely important to know what your weapons are actually scaling off of in terms of your stats. Now, moving on a little bit, the actual level design is so far pretty good. Again, very traditional Souls-like, a lot of opening up shortcuts that let you move through the level more easily. There's a lot of, again, little side passages that'll bring you around behind enemies and allow you to perform those sneak attacks or just get free hits in from the back of an enemy and catch them off guard. There's a lot of jumping. There's a surprising amount of verticality to things. Oftentimes you'll be maneuvering around the scenery, so to speak, and then leading yourself over paths. I thought they did a really good job with that. So definitely expect to be jumping and moving. Later in the game, you'll actually get access to some tools which will help you traverse the levels and things much more easily. And we'll see you kind of zipping around and moving, again, very vertically. But even in the beginning of the game, you can see snippets of what's to come there. But towards the end of the initial act, you'll eventually get access to a horseless carriage, otherwise known as just a car, I believe. But basically, you'll get a carriage that will let you move around the various parts that you have access to, which will give you access to the various levels. But to kind of wrap this up with some general thoughts and not drag this out too long, overall, very cool game. They tried some unique things that are going to help set this game apart from the many Souls-like games out there. But even still, there are a few things that concern me a little bit. For starters, again, the grenades seem ridiculous. It's kind of like a little easy mode, which is kind of strange because there is an assist mode that you can turn on, which is actually an easy mode, which even disqualifies you from achievements, they tell you. But if you're willing to just grind out some grenades, you can pretty much easy mode everything. Another thing to keep in mind that I noticed is that the armor progression, which are items you can actually equip in addition to your weapons, you will be equipping armor as well. The armor seems very linear in terms of its progression, whereas the weapons facilitate play styles. A lot of the armor I've been finding is just very directly upgraded, and it's a very clear line of progression in terms of the armor. And I'm curious how that's going to play out in the late game. But beyond that, I love the steampunk vibe. Again, I kind of love the way the combat feels and the way the characters actually move. All of the automatons are really cool to see. And the combat feels really good. And there's not really a block system per se. You're not really going to be blocking a lot, just mostly dodging and moving around. In fact, there wasn't even really a parry system that I saw. But that kind of leads to this sort of ebb and flow to combat where you're just kind of like dodging and dancing out of the way, as the character is a dancer, as you might imagine. And then following up with devastating attacks. Now, again, this does have its weak points. For instance, some of the smaller enemies can just be absolutely locked down with heavy attacks. It staggers them so much that they just never get a chance to move. And if there's not more than one of them, you're just going to destroy them. Literally just spamming a heavy attack. But overall, again, to wrap this thing up, combat feels really good. I like the story. I like the aesthetic. The level design's really good. The combat feels really cool. There's sort of an ebb and flow to it. And while I don't think this game is going to impress anybody who does not already like Souls-likes, I personally am enjoying it. And it's definitely an awesome first Souls-like from Spiders, the developer, who is not normally known for Souls-likes, but rather more traditional RPGs like Greedfall. But that's all I've got for you guys today. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.